I think it's time to begin. Good morning, everybody. I hope you slept well and recovered from the rigors of yesterday afternoon and had a more expeditious journey this morning on the buses. Our introductory session this morning will be presented by Shabbir Akhtar. We will have a presentation of the texts. You have the texts in your booklet. These are the Quranic texts, and then we will break into groups. So from now until 9:45, we have Shabbir's introduction and initial discussion, clarification. So Shabbir will speak for 25 minutes, and then we will open the floor. We have a microphone which can be passed around, and this one can also. You have your texts available? Jonathan pointed out to me that there are a couple of spots where, because of the font that was used, some dots have wandered in where they shouldn't be. But these are not Arabic dots. They're round dots, so they appear in a couple of places. But if you have your magnifying glass, I apologize for the small print. If you have your magnifying glass, you'll see that we haven't been interfering with the text of the Quran. But
I'm dropping my charge as Dan's trying to modify it.
we Christians, in Tahrif,
Thank you very much, Dan, for that introduction. Just one preliminary remark, and then I'll look at the themes which motivated me to select those particular Quranic passages. And the preliminary remark is that, in my view, there is no theology in Islam at all. That is to say, in the Christian sense of theology, the study of the nature and essence of God. And let me explain what I mean by that before we look at the passages. And also to suggest that, in fact, there is something which replaces theology. I've invented a word for it, and I'll talk about that when I finish my talk, what I think is the substitute for theology. Now, what I mean here is that the revelation of the Quran gives us a revelation of the will, the legal will of God, and through the attributes of God, something of his moral characteristics too, including those relating to justice and mercy. But in Islam, I think what we call theology really collapses into hermeneutics. And I think hermeneutics itself often, regrettably, collapses into a kind of barren philology, study of the origin of words. This is a defect which is also, in my view, present in New Testament scholarship as well. I suppose most Muslims would say that, with the exception of heterodox and mystical traditions like Sufism, the idea of theology is presumptuous. So it goes against a kind of intellectual humility. Of course, I say this ad hominem in the context of our dealings with Christian theologians, and I'd be very happy to take questions on that. But that is my view as a preliminary to what I'm going to say. The selections I've made, I don't need to read them. Surah 2, for example, the first selection, it says very clearly that God has created mankind for the worship of God. If we look at this particular claim in the context of what I've already said about my reservations about theology, then obviously what's meant here is that we are created for the worship of God. That doesn't exclude a more intimate relationship of the love of God. After all, what may begin in the fear of God or in the worship of God or the awe of the majesty of God may end up in love, but I don't think it's a primary focus in the Quran, the love of God. As I say, in my view, it's a heterodox opinion. What we talk about the worship of God and the ritual worship of God, the canonical worship of God, it's a question worth bearing in mind in our context here, is whether obedience to God's law amounts to obedience to God. That would be the question for interfaith theology. Does obedience to God's law amount to obedience to God? I mean, it has many analogues and parallels in the whole of this area. For example, does obeying purity laws amount to purity? There are rituals about ablution, for example, which preface the prayer. That's the kind of thought I want to plant in your minds. So, of course, it's true that Muslims believe that the goal of creation is for the worship of God, but with these provisos in mind, obviously to say something, to go back to the point about the nature of God, that God is love, would be ultra vires. It would be beyond the authority of the warrant that Revelation gives us. The selection from Quran, Surah An-Nisa, verse 1, is about the caution of God, taqwa, if you like, fear of God, fear of infringing His laws and hudud, or limits that have been set for us. And the reason I chose that is because in this particular verse, the fear of God, the taqwa, informs both male-female relationships and the broader social realm as well. In other words, our social duties are derivative from our awareness of the greatness of God. We are brothers and sisters on earth because we live under the sovereignty of God. This puts us in fundamental conflict with secular humanism, which rejects that opinion, which says that politics need not have any mystery or revelation in it. The democratic system sorts it out. We don't need a supernatural appeal to authority, whereas the Quranic view is that it is not the case, that in fact what informs true human relationships and authentic human flourishing presupposes the fear of God, or taqwa here, the due regard for God's laws. In other words, the due regard for God's laws dictates social norms on earth. That any politics which is radically human is flawed by definition. The other selections, the one from Surah Al-Imran, for example, about the creation of inanimate nature, there I chose that because of the link it has to the notion of reflection on the signs of God. Now, there are 2 or 3 important issues here about the reflection of the signs of God inside nature. The obvious point is, of course, the reason why the Quran is mentioning this is to point out to a providential provision or system of providential provision that has been made for human needs. And I'll come back to that point. But the primary reason why it interests us today is because of its implication that there is an inherent teleology or purpose in nature. The implication of that is that nature is a subject, not an object. The subject is hidden, it's God. It's almost a sacramental view of nature, which of course is forbidden in Islam, but I use that word in terms of nomenclature because of the presence of Christian colleagues. Unlike, say, pantheism or a Taoist metaphysics where there are occult forces within nature, the Quranic view is that these are laws of nature which have been created by an architect, by a mind, that they've been made deliberately intelligible to the human subject, to the human creature who has a mind. That nature is under a single sovereignty, which implies the possibility of empirical science, a single sovereignty, intelligible, lawful regularity. It's not a coincidence, by the way, that India, which has been the home of many religions, polytheistic India, has not been a habitat for the emergence of natural empirical science. The habitat for the emergence of natural science has been Christian Europe, partly under Islamic influence. I would summarize it by saying that although the Muslims were very important in stimulating that interest in science, I believe it's Christian Europe that institutionalized that interest with the rise of the feudal academia of the University of Paris, for example, and its child, Oxford. Hurts the vanity of Oxford people to think that they were the child of someone else. But we do have that notion of the institutionalization of learning. If I can put it in the form of a motto, the worshipper goes via the laboratory to the mosque. So empirical science is fine, but it's still under the sovereignty of God. The implication being that all this reflection on the beauty and diversity of nature and its laws is good. Islam claims to be a rational religion, meaning it has no room for paradox, because I assume we only need paradox if there's no literal way of stating the absolute truth. What would be the point of paradox if it could be stated in a literal way? The implication here is that science has to be ethical. That is to say, you can't have a utilitarian pleading that, oh, I'm merely making this bomb, I'm not responsible for who uses it, what its consequences are. That would not be permitted in Islam. Because of the teleology that involves God and because values are inherent, it puts certain limits upon the development of science and technology. It has clear implications for ecology and the future of our planet. I don't think this differs much from the Christian view of the custodian of nature, man and woman generically used here, as being custodians of nature. And the same ideas in Islam, except that Islam emphasizes the political dimension of this. So the vicegerency of man as a colonialist over nature is conditional that he is a servant under God. So the two are dual responsibilities that are there. As I say, rhetorically, it may sound a bit different from the Christian account in Genesis, but I think the idea is the same, that we are responsible stewards. But the political implication, nonetheless, is important because Islam is a twin birth of faith and power. It created an empire while Christianity inherited an empire. And that makes it a fundamentally different religion vis-a-vis the question of how the world is to be run. The reason why the Quran has such a very fecund discussion of the signs, and the signs of God range over a vast territory, both in terms of the beauties of nature and the beauties of human relationships. I believe that the reason is that this arouses the desire and feeds the desire for wonder. So, for example, if you're a poet, for example, as I am, incidentally, I should add here, having published in 3 volumes in English, it feeds, I think, a sense of the wonder of God's creation. What is puzzling, however, to me, finally on this point, is that theologically nature is ambivalent. That is to say, there's nothing in nature that forces you to be a believer. I think it's quite possible to be a conscientious disbeliever. Just looking at nature, it's subject to an ambivalent interpretation. The same things which are grounds for gratitude can also be grounds for evidence of malice in nature. So I think the teleological argument doesn't fully work. So I'm quite puzzled by the fact that there are great poets who are staunch atheists. Whereas to me, when I look at the beauties of nature and the associated beauties of human relationships, it seems evident in some sense that there is a supreme mind behind it. As I say, intellectually that cannot be proven. It remains to some extent a matter of faith. The goal of creation ultimately is, of course, the return to God. The Quran talks about the fact that you shall be returned to God and will be then subject to resurrection and judgment. The judgment, the reward for good actions and the requital for evil, that is an area that I've actually dubbed an ergotology, works of the law. I think that's what Islam is actually interested in, not in theology, but ergotology from the Greek word ergonomou, my work on Galatians, works of the law. I think that ergotology, this neologism that I have, is really what Islam replaces theology with. So, I mean, people say, fiqh and sharia, that's fine to law, but I prefer the word ergotology because works of the law in the broader sense of including etiquette and morality and not just positive law. So I prefer this particular word that I've got. I'm sure you've read many passages in the Quran, typically whose message is that God has created human beings with the purpose of testing them vis-a-vis their actions. In fact, the Quran says in Surah Mulk, for example, at the very beginning, that we have created death and life in order to test you, which of you is best in works. And in other surahs like Yunus, it mentions that it is with justice that God will look at your works, with justice, bilqist, for those who are believers and disbelievers. So that becomes, if you like, the final goal of creation. It relates in the Quran itself to an Islamic anthropology, which I think is very important in this context where we are, because, of course, sin, insofar as the word sin can be written with a small s, because the human condition is not one of sin with a capital S, but there are sinful actions that human beings do. But this attitude, this disposition to do what is wrong, the nafs al-ammara bis-su, the soul that orders evil used in Surah Yusuf, is a part of our divine constitution. We are actually made to be sinners. So in other words, sin is not a result of the fall. It's not the result of disobedience. It's not a catastrophe. It's not a curse. It is natural and biological fact about our condition, which is what people like Marxists would say. But of course, in the Quran, it is ordained as well. Although it's a biological, natural fact, it's one which is also ordained, which is what distinguishes it from Marxism. It has been said, incidentally, in this context, that one of the biggest defects of Marxism, even though it has the same concern with social justice that Islam has, is that Marxism has no metaphysics of death. And secondly, its utopia is in the future, not in the past. Islam has the advantage, in other words. Muslims would say that, we have a metaphysics of death, and our utopia has already happened once, and therefore it may be recreated. So I think that Islamic anthropology is actually quite ambivalent, meaning the capacity for doing evil and for flouting God's law perversely is inbuilt into our nature. It's not a cause for despair or really for any kind of complex machinery of atonement and redemption, because obviously that would be, the Christian scheme on the assumptions which nourish it is perfectly consistent, but I think it's in fundamental conflict with the Quranic view. In other words, God created death not as a punishment for sin, but simply a biological fact that we will die. We have a fixed lease on this good earth in our tenure, and during which we accumulate good works, which are then subject to divine assessment. And finally, in the last about 5 minutes, I want to say that when I read the Quran, I'm very struck by what might be called the seriousness of its ethical or moral vocation for human beings. This is quite puzzling in one sense, however, because the Quran does not recognize the possibility of a conscientious disbeliever. If somebody is a disbeliever, in some sense they're fundamentally wicked and perverse. And yet, we also know from Surah Qiyamah, for example, that there is a self-accusing soul which is the possession of the human being, al-insan, in the generic sense, not of the believer, but of humanity in virtue of their birthright as children of Adam. So we all have this self-accusing soul, or the conscience. And yet it's not possible for the conscience to be exercised autonomously. It must be exercised in an Islamic context, meaning in view of the fact that we are congenitally Muslim or made to be submissive to God with a small m. So the idea is that the moral vocation of mankind is only fully authentic and realizable given the spiritual nature of mankind. That, if you exercise your prerogative to be submissive to the will of God, do you actually become a fully ethical being? That's a very profound point of conflict with existentialists and secular humanists and philosophers of the human condition who do reject the inspiration of the Quran or of the Bible. One other implication of the view that the ethical vocation of humanity, the judgment of our works, is fundamental, is actually internal to Islam. I think that the way in which both secular humanists and some Muslim mystics or Sufis prioritize and put the aesthetic dimension above the moral is a misunderstanding of Scripture. That is to say, such apocryphal hadiths moving outside the Quran as God being a treasure who is awaiting to be discovered. I think it's an immoral view because the Quran clearly says that we did not create mankind in jest or abasan, without a purpose. Now, I think purpose here means moral, because if you look at the totality of Quranic passages, they seem to be extremely serious about the ethical vocation of mankind. In the context of secular humanism, one of the things when I wrote my work against Salman Rushdie was I accused that secular elite of the idolatry of art, which is the major sin of the secular elite. And it's the main reason why their lives are empty. It's quite ironic, isn't it, that secular humanists think that the lives of believers are empty when their own lives are mainly filled with alcohol. I've never understood the extraordinary irony of saying to Muslims and Christians, your lives are empty, that's why you need religion. And you think to yourself, well, are the lives of religious believers any more empty than those of secular humanists? And I think the answer in this audience, at least, doesn't need to be preached. So one point is against the secular humanist view, and the other one is a point against, if I may say so, internally to Islam. And I think that both in terms of the requirement to think about God, to reflect about Him, this must be in the context of developing a deeper sense of awe of the majesty and sovereignty of God, rather than, it seems to me, to seek intimacy with God in the sense of seeking an ultimate kind of knowledge of His essence. And of course, I'm fully aware that saying this means that instead of building bridges, perhaps one is burning some of them with Christian colleagues. But I think it's only fair to be able to say that this is where the Islamic view is, that the basic reason, the goal of creation is essentially ethical, and it is the medium is through obedience to God's law. Whether that amounts to obedience to God Himself, and whether that amounts to the achievement of love and intimacy is a debated question. But in my view, the Islamic answer is that it doesn't. Can I stop there, Dan? Because I think I've said everything I wanted.
Thank you. Could I ask you just of this range of texts that you chose for us? Are there particular ones? You have a few minutes. Yes. Particular ones that you would like the groups to focus on.
Since we have a bit of time left over. When I was asked by David Marshall and Dan to choose the text, I'm afraid I chose far too many, really, but just in terms of a representative set of texts, I suppose the very first one I chose about addressing the Ya Ayyuhan Nas. It's a general address. Of course, as you know, the Quran never has the address Ya Ayyuhal Arab. It's not an ethnic revelation. It's general, so it is addressed to mankind here. Worship your Lord. It's a direct command, who created you and those before you, so that you may become mindful of Him, la'allakum tattaqun, so that you may acquire taqwa. And then there's further writings about the creation of the earth, and the hint about both about the knowledge of God and the fact that this is a providential provision for human beings, and His capacity to create the world simply by the command kun fayakun. In the second selection from Al Imran, it goes on to the signs of God within inanimate nature, and how these help you to reflect and make you realize that nature actually has a hidden subject, a teleology. So it's interesting that while you're asked to reflect upon inanimate nature, you're actually asked to discern the presence of a sacramental presence of a subject, meaning God, a holy presence, something which I think Christians would have sympathy to. The selection from the first verse of Surah An-Nisa, addressing mankind. Again, notice addressing mankind, not to believers, not Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, but of the whole of mankind. In some passages, the Bani Adam, the children of Adam, but in this one, again, Ya ayyuhan nas, or what Marxists would translate as, Ali Shariati used to translate this verse as, "O masses," which is a political connotation to it. "O masses, if you like, be mindful of your Lord who created you from a single soul, and from it created its mate." This passage, incidentally, is very interesting for the Islamic view of the nature of gender relations. We are essentially a monogenetic species. We have a single origin, male and female, and from that, the division into male and female is probably for social purposes, clearly not relevant for the spiritual equality of men and women. And then the one from Surah Al-An'am about the creation of the heavens and the earth is a polemical passage. As you can see, it's directed against the Meccan idolaters who thought that God had 3 daughters, but also, I believe, it's directed against the Christians. So those would be the 4 passages which that I think would be important. I mean, there's so many others that talk about erotology and reward, and I'll leave that up to the choice of the group.
Thank you, Shabbir. The floor is open now for questions of clarification, or before we go to our groups. Jane, please.
How do you feel about the translation of taqwa as mindfulness?
Well, of course, it seems to me influenced by Buddhism almost. Abdul Halim is a very good translation. But I think that God consciousness, mindfulness, these are perfectly acceptable translations, but they seem to downplay the element of fear, which I think is fundamental in the Quran. I mean, there's no point denying that. I mean, it's also an emphasis in the Old Testament too. You know, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. So I don't think it's exclusive to Islam. You get it in the Torah a great deal as well. But yeah, I think mindfulness is perhaps misleading, Jane, as a translation of taqwa. It does mean due caution of a sovereign master whose hudud or limits have been set. So it's more of not quite dread or horror, but fear, which is a more intelligent emotion because it has the intellectual component that you are afraid of incurring somebody's displeasure.
So, yeah.
Wouldn't you say you're mindful of
Speak up.
something that you fear? I mean, it doesn't have to conclude fear that you're mindfulness, but it includes more of spirituality that's accompanied with a fear, a sort of a fear.
Absolutely right. But I'm saying ad hominem, in the kind of cultures we live in, because the word mindfulness has become the monopoly of Buddhists in California mainly, it seems that we should try and avoid it in case of the cultural connotations. But I agree with you that stripped of those cultural connotations, it's perfectly valid to say mindful. And as I say, I have enormous regard for Abdul Halim, who's a personal friend as well. I think his translation is very idiomatic, very attractive, especially to non-Muslims who are new to the faith.
Because then fear also takes away the spirituality of taqwa.
Well, as I say, it's an intelligent fear, and this type of fear in which the life of faith may begin in fear, but it can mature into attitudes of love, and love includes the desire not to displease the person you love. That's true in human relationships as well, right? So I don't want to imply that mindfulness is wrong or that there can't be a component of love in it, but I still think that the need for fear is there so that religion does not deteriorate into a sentimental regard for God's laws. In other words, where in fact you don't believe it. Because don't forget, the Quran also warns, among mankind are those who say we believe in God in the last day, but they don't actually believe. And the fact that God is saying that himself, and the fact that the person making this claim actually says clearly, I believe in God in the last day, and of him God is saying he's not actually a believer. So there must be reasons why that is said. So in other words, it's quite possible to pay lip service, a kind of sentimental regard for religion. And incidentally, a lot of Muslims accuse Christians of that. I personally think that's a slander, having known Christians intimately. But I think that, there are reasons why people can get that cultural misapprehension about other people. So even translations of this type can be misleading.
Yes, thank you. I was just wondering if you could clarify. You said, I thought, that sin was natural in the Muslim perspective, and that it was inbuilt into nature, the capacity to do evil. You then sort of went from that to sort of going from sin to that human beings' death was a part of the, as it were, ordained order. Which, from a Christian perspective, at least in some of the earlier fathers, you don't necessarily have to collapse sin and death. Anyways, I was just wondering if you could clarify that.
Sure. The somewhat Teutonic desire to capitalize the word sin, I think is perfectly justified in translating, for example, hamartia in Greek, in Paul's writing in Romans, and his discussion of the human condition in Galatians too. But I think in Islam, there's no such thing as sin with a capital S. There are sinful actions, but the human condition is not one of sin with a capital S. As far as death is concerned, insofar as death enters the created order as a result of sin or the fall, I don't disagree that there are differences within the Christian tradition, for example, the patristic literature you were mentioning. But in general, if we're going just to the Pauline sources, for example, or just the New Testament, if we stick to, within a very narrow campus of the canonical scriptures, then yes, death is a curse and it is a reward for our disobedience to God. And that's not a Quranic view. God has created death and life in order to test you. You're on probation vis-a-vis erotology. It has nothing to do with any sinfulness on our part. The capacity to do evil, the nafs al-ammara bisu, in Arabic it means the soul that strongly urges, ammara is an intensive in Arabic, strongly urges you towards su or evil. It's used actually in the story of the seduction scene in the tale of Joseph in the Quran. And because it's not clear who speaks this verse, by the way, there's tafsir on that. But if it's a prophet speaking, one may presume that there's some truth in it. If it's God speaking, it's by definition true. But the idea is that the capacity to do what's evil, to perversely flout the law of God, is actually a divine intention. It's not something which is a lapse on the part of humans. That is an Islamic view. I mean, I can't myself, say that it's evidently justified. I think that requires some argument. And for that, one would need to engage in theology, which I think is anathema.
First of all, I mean, I can only have tremendous affection for somebody who points out the flaws in
Can you speak up?
California religion. So, sorry. And I think, I mean, in
Oh, sorry.
having sat through countless California weddings where Paul's letters are abused for the purposes of talking about love, is love as a, I mean, as I understand this is sort of like a cosmic force, the transcendence of forms in the Platonic and in the biblical sense. If you're going to think about, so fear of God, is there sort of a similar cosmic dimension of fear? If love is something that sort of brings you up, not like the Officer and Gentleman song, but I mean, what does fear do? Is fear like another direction, or is it a same direction but just a different idiom?
Well, of course, the fear of God doesn't mean the terror of God. It's not an unintelligent emotion. If you wanted me to give you an analogy from the New Testament, I mean, phobos, that type of fear is not what is meant here. Phobos, the word, which is the origin of our word phobia, a kind of unintelligent fear. This is reasoned caution, if you like. Fear is perhaps, I mean, these are limitations of language. Fear is in English generally a very raw emotion, whereas I think obviously taqwa doesn't mean that. Taqwa means due regard, caution. Caution that arises out of the awareness that a wise legislator or a sovereign has set these limits. So it's right to be cautious. So it's not a pure kind of fear. Now, does fear in the English sense have a nobler kind of dimension which exalts people in the way that love does? No, I don't think it does. It's not that type of emotion.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your paper. I want to ask you why you think aesthetic and moral cannot go together. And you said, the way you understand the Quran, it's really about morality than evolving this relationship with God and closeness and so on. And why can't they go together? And then especially in the Sufi, but not exclusively in the Sufi tradition, there is the sense in which seeing God's beautiful names in creation and in your own self is connected to your willingness to reflect that divine beauty in the form of compassion, in the form of justice. So why can't they go together? And one more thing, that passage about that says that God has created human beings only to worship Him, لِيَعْبُدُنِي. In the traditional commentaries, they refer back to Ibn Abbas very early, a figure who glosses that term so that they may worship me as لِيَعْرُفُنِي, so that they may know me. So knowledge of God is intimately connected with worship in the way I see it. So I'm wondering why.
The question about the relationship between the ethical and the aesthetic. No, of course, it's entirely true that the Quran is a book which is very self-consciously aesthetically beautiful. In fact, that's part of its credentials or ijaz. Its linguistic beauty, supremacy of literary taste. It's a book concerned with its own beauty, right? So I'm not talking about that, but I'm saying that the prophetic vocation as well as the Quran's own aesthetic beauty are both in the service of morality. So both are means to an end. That doesn't mean to say that a true believer isn't aware of the aesthetic beauty of creation. I said, in fact, the ayat, the signs of God, arouse wonder at the beauty of creation and at God's grace and mercy in creation. All of that's true. But I'm saying that The paper is about the goal of creation. So far as there's an ultimate goal, the ethical imperative is more profound, I think, and is more profoundly emphasized. The danger in giving too much importance to the aesthetic dimension is what I said was the idolatry of art. I believe that all art is praise. Right? It's just the secular humanists don't know this, which is why they're not aware of this. It's essentially a religious act. All art is praise. Even if you're a secular artist, you're praising something. It could be the beauty of a woman, it could be the beauty of nature, it could be the beauty of an animal, it could be the beauty of something inanimate like a flower. But essentially it's an act of praise. And of course, in religion, this is a duty, the duty to be grateful, the duty to gratitude. But it's still a duty. Notice that even the duty to praise the world using the best possible language, being a great poet. But the point is, it's a duty, and the word duty to me is inevitably an ethical term. And semi-legal as well, if it's by the force of the state. But it's not an aesthetic word. Duty is not an aesthetic word. So the danger in the aesthetic interpretation is that it makes religion into something mawkish, sentimental, religious, a kind of abuse of religion. It's not true religion as such.
Should be, sorry, Sajjad.
To be honest, I don't know where to start, but let me just try and, because I disagreed with practically every word you said. Let me, yes, and I was actually thinking precisely that. One of the fundamental assumptions you seem to be making, well, I think there are two fundamental assumptions. One is that the text is pretty transparent and you should read it literally, and there's certainly no need to go beyond what is there. And secondly, you seem to have an assumption about what orthodoxy and heterodoxy is, and you're quite adamant about that. So, the idea that an aesthetic approach is unethical. At one point you said the love of God is not central. To argue that it is a heterodox idea. This kind of throws out of the window, I would say, 99.9% of Muslim traditions over history. And I just don't understand how that can really be justified. And even if you're saying that, if we come back to the crux of this particular topic, I mean, let's leave aside the methodological arguments for a second. If the goal of creation is some sort of moral imperative so that people do, I guess, good works, well, why should they? I mean, God doesn't need our works in any sense. And also you admitted that it's entirely possible for someone who doesn't believe to have notions of moral imperative and act morally. So what's the point of that then? If it's about moral imperative and yet you don't need to believe to act upon that. There's just so much here, and I'm not sure how ergotology, as you put it, is a helpful development at all. I mean, I totally acknowledge that the term theology can be problematic, but I would actually argue that in terms of what might approximate to theology in Islam, in some ways it's a richer tradition, quite simply because there are different ways of approaching this question of how you, I mean, there actually are many other Christian traditions of how you approach understanding the nature of God and what it means to be fully human. So I could go on, and I won't. Yeah, at the crux of it, literalism and orthodoxy, as someone who probably is deeply heterodox, I find that problematic.
Thank you, Sajjad, for those interesting comments. With regard to the question of the interpretation of the Quran, I believe that there should be some limits to the plasticity of revelation, meaning there's a great danger that the intelligent commentator can make you believe anything and extract anything from Scripture. Insofar as Scripture is meant to be guidance, which obviously the book, the Quran and the Bible are. The Quran being somewhat different in the sense that all this guidance was in fact implemented in an actual political providence. You know, a particular society was created. So when the Quran says basically, you know, in gradual terms says don't drink alcohol, then at one stage Muhammad, the Prophet, implemented that ruling. So the Quran actually is a scripture that was framed the life of the Prophet, and he built a nation based on that. So it's a scripture which, although it's true that many of its verses, as you well know, are of course subject to allegorical interpretation, they're very mysterious. The Quran itself lays down its own principle in Surah 3 verse 7, that, you know, there's some material which is al-Kitab, some material which is obvious and, you know, muhkamat, and then there's mutashabihat, which may be material that's subject to allegorical and more of a batin type, you know, inner interpretation. I don't deny that. And of course, there couldn't have been this amount of literature about the nature of the Quran if there weren't obscurities in the text. All of that is true. But insofar as it qualifies as a book of guidance, then it seems to me that there has to be some limits upon what is legitimate interpretation. Otherwise, the danger is it's no longer a book of guidance, but really a work that inspires metaphysical curiosity and that dreaded tendency towards theological speculation.
I mean, it's not just about rules, that's the basic point. I mean, it's guidance to what? It's a revelation which reveals what God is. That's the point. So you know, the rules are, I would say, these are the juziyat. There's like the small things, like for example, whether you drink alcohol or not. This is a tiny kind of detail of human existence. It's not the central thing.
Well,
the fact
right.
that, you know, you pray like this or like that at a particular time, it's a detail. What's important is that prayer is a communication and a link to God. That you abstain from certain acts or you perform certain acts because it links you to God.
Well, you know, I've been very interested in this question about the spirit of the law and the letter of the law, which is why I was investigating Galatians, exactly the point you're making, right? But, you know, very briefly, with regard to why do good deeds, you did, I've just got a couple of minutes, yeah. You asked why should a person do good deeds. I mean, it's certainly possible for God to assign a virtuous monotheist to hell if he wanted to. Of course, I suspect he wouldn't do that.
Most theologians would absolutely disagree.
Well, Mutazilites would disagree with me, but
No, most Shabbir would disagree with you as well.
yeah. Well, I mean, you know,
They would, yes, why? On what basis
Yeah.
would you be assigned to that?
On the basis God can do whatever he wants.
yeah. Right. That's what I'm saying. He won't do that. Yeah. So Dan, you better use your chairmanship.
Clearly, there are many things to be discussed, and I have a whole line of people who would like to intervene at this point. But I think, given that we've only got just a couple of minutes before we take a brief break, you can get your drinks and then go to your groups. We don't have to thrash it all out here. This is a moment for clarifications and for getting us, I suppose, chewing on things before we break into the groups. So just in the very brief time, is there some other question, just of clarification, rather than substantive discussion that was requested? Tom?
Yeah, I have a question for clarification. You were talking about how people reflect on nature and are led to the various qualities of God and God's hand in nature. But this is not necessarily so. Because of the ambivalent nature of the universe, we maybe would find its predatory side and not arrive at this knowledge of God's nature and attributes. Well, isn't this contradictory, or seems contradictory to what you said about the Quran? There's no possibility of conscientious non-belief. It seems like you're allowing the possibility of conscientious non-belief in the first statement.
Thomas, right? Yeah, thanks, Thomas, for that question. I've actually dealt with this question in some depth in a recent volume of a trilogy. It's called The Quran and the Secular Mind. This is a contradiction that I have created. I mean, what I'm saying is there's a theological puzzle to me, why in my independent human reasoning it seems that there is the possibility of conscientious disbelief. But I said that it's God's prerogative if he wanted to send a virtuous monotheist even to hell, let alone a conscientious disbeliever. So the difficulty is about conscientious disbelief, not disbelief. Right? I think it is a theological puzzle, which is my way of saying that I'm not sure how to answer that question, but I call it a theological puzzle because I remain committed to the total truth of the Quran. If I were not committed to the total truth of the Quran, there'd be no grounds for puzzlement.
Thanks very much. As I say, lots to chew on there. Let me just run through. When David and I last year were doing our initial planning for this, we did we did a single brainstorming because between us we probably only had one brain at that point because at the end of we were also drenched. We had various questions which we gave to the speakers yesterday, but they're not in the book of texts. I was going to rephrase them because they were a little bit of a jumble that came out of brainstorming, but let me share them with you now. The questions that occurred to us: why is there anything at all? Why isn't there nothing? Why did or does God create in general? Why did God create beings like us? Creation out of nothing over against other standings of the eternity of matter and God as craftsman rather than creator. This is addressed in Richard Bauckham's paper. It was addressed also by Mohsen in his paper yesterday. God's continuing creative action, that was also addressed by Mohsen and Lucy. The immanence and transcendence of God. How is God present to or in creation? You'll recognize these themes that came out in the speakers. What is the goal or final purpose of God's creative activity, both for humans and for the wider creation? And then biblical and Quranic eschatologies really come to this. When we first thought of the structure of this, we were starting with creation, and on the third day we would have ended up with eschatology. But many of the commentators on our first draft said, no, you have to get the eschatology right in at the beginning because it's the creation is for that final purpose. So we don't wait and we don't talk about creation except in the light of what God's final purpose is. So let's bring that into the first day. So I just share those thoughts with you. You've heard them rehearsed by Lucy and Mohsen and in the other papers as well. And David has one point.
Just to say that there's a different set of questions for day 2 and day 3. Those were the questions which we gave to the speakers who selected texts for today, and we can share a similar set of texts for each of the following days. So that's just to say. So those might be helpful also for those sharing groups in helping to frame your discussions.
This afternoon we are studying the biblical texts in relation to the same questions. Our presenter, as you know, since you've had his paper and you have a copy of it in front of you, I hope. If you don't, then please raise your hand and we'll get you one. The presenter is Richard Bauckham, who informed us last evening that St Andrews University is not, in fact, at Ridley Hall in Cambridge. Those are two separate institutions. Who knew? Emeritus from St Andrews, though still, I think, connected through St Andrews for an ongoing project, and call it retirement, in emeritate at Cambridge. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you. So this is God's creation, and it's called A Christian Theological Account. I call it A Christian Theological Account because, as you would no doubt expect, not all theologians in the Christian tradition would agree with everything that I've said. I've tried to actually deal with all the suggested topics. I hope the result is not too dense. We start with creator and creation, the difference. That God created heaven and earth, or simply all things, is a fundamental Christian belief, repeatedly stated in Scripture and featuring in the ecumenical creeds. It entails an absolute difference between God and all that is not God, absolute in the sense that this difference is incomparable with any of the relative differences between creatures. The difference can be stated in a number of ways. For example, it means that all creatures are utterly dependent on God for their very existence, as well as for being the creatures they are, and for all that makes for their flourishing. This absolute dependence transcends all the relationships of dependence and interdependence among creatures, and so to speak, places them all on in the same ontological category to which only God does not belong. God is dependent on nothing other than God. Among other implications, this ontological discontinuity between God and creation entails a profound difference between our knowledge of creatures and our knowledge of God. Another way of characterizing the difference between God and creation is to say that God's existence alone is necessary. God cannot not be, whereas creation's existence and the existence of every specific creature are contingent. They need not have been, existing only because God wills it. A statement that gets closer perhaps to the question of why God creates is that creation is entirely God's gift. Again, this implies a relationship between God, the giver, and creation as God's gift that transcends all relationships of giving within creation, all of which are grounded in God's gift of everything. The distinctions between necessary and contingent existence and between divine giver and created gift require that God creates in freedom. Undoubtedly, this implies that he acts under no external constraint or influence, something that the first creation account in Genesis 1 expresses in the form of creation by God's sovereign decree. In what way God's freedom in creating relates to God's own character is a more difficult and debated issue, to which I shall very briefly return in section 5. Finally, another way of characterizing the difference between God and creatures is to say that God is infinite and creatures finite. In other words, creatures are by nature limited, especially by the fact that they can exist only in time and space. The traditional metaphysical attributes of God, omnipotence, omniscience, and so forth, are simply ways of saying that God is not limited in the ways that creatures are. At least since Thomas Aquinas, some theologians have said that the relationship between creator and creation that I've just sketched does not in itself require that creation has a temporal beginning. An eternal world existing in absolute dependence on God would be a created world distinguished from the creator in all the ways I've described. Nevertheless, the Bible undoubtedly relates creation to a temporal beginning, and almost all Christian theologians have affirmed such a beginning, even if, like Aquinas, they have thought that the concept of creation does not itself require a beginning. While the doctrine of creation entails an absolute difference between God and creation, this does not preclude an essential sense in which creation resembles God. In the case of humans, this is quite explicit in the biblical idea of humans created in the image of God, but other creatures also reflect God in a wide variety of ways. What God creates expresses who God is, but expresses it in a distinctively creaturely, therefore limited ways. The immense diversity of creation, which is undoubtedly even greater than we yet know, is related to the fact that any creature can resemble God only in specific and limited ways. Christian theologians have explored ways in which not only God's manifold goodness as such, but also its Trinitarian form are reflected in creation. That God creates by his own word encapsulates the idea that in creating God expresses who he is, while the Trinitarian self-relationship of God in himself is the ground for the relational character of creation, made up as it is of interdependent webs of relationships, and especially for human relationships. Finally, it's important not to think of creaturely resemblances to God in isolation from God's active relationships with creation. At least in the case of humans, this means that through knowing God and experiencing God's love, humans are drawn into ever greater resemblance to God. From the kind of participation in God that creatures have through their created resemblances to God, creation progresses in new creation to participation in the very life of God. Section 2, God's presence to, with, and in creation. In relation to his creation, God has often been said to be both transcendent, that is, beyond creation, and immanent, meaning present in creation. It's important that transcendence refers to difference, as I have already described it, rather than to distance. It's precisely because God is other than creation that God can be present to and in creation in ways that creatures cannot be present to or in each other. The presence of creatures to each other is necessarily mediated by time and space, but God, who is not limited by time or space, can be present immediately to creation. This is a key difference from Platonic or Gnostic approaches in which God cannot relate immediately to creation, or at least to this material creation, because God is so different from it. From a Christian perspective, one might say that such a God is not different enough. His difference is merely an extreme form of the difference that separates creatures from one another. Christian theology will maintain rather that God's transcendence does not impede but enables his immanence. At the same time, transcendence means that God is free to be present in creation or not, and this presence does not exhaust God's being. That is, there is infinitely more to God than his relationship to creation. The metaphysical attributes of God affirm that God is not limited as creatures are. In the tradition of so-called classical theism, they've been understood as excluding their opposites. God cannot be spatial. If God is omnipresent, he cannot be spatial. If he's eternal, he cannot be temporal, weak, passible, and so forth. But this interpretation of them would seem to be itself a limit on God's freedom, and is difficult to square with many of the claims of the Bible and the Christian tradition. It is possible, however, instead to interpret the metaphysical attributes as not excluding their opposites. God is not limited by space, as finite creatures are, but he is free also to be present in space. God is not limited by time, as creatures are, but he is free also to be present in time. He is free even to be weak and passible. In all such cases, God remains transcendent beyond such creaturely limitations, but he can also enter the finite conditions of the life of his creatures in order to relate to them in various ways. The incarnation is a unique instance of this, a case in which God, while remaining God, exists also actually as a finite creature. The doctrine of creation itself requires a continuing and constant presence of God to creation, in that it remains utterly dependent on God and can exist only as God sustains it in existence. But we should not limit God's immanence to this unvarying upholding of creation. In scripture and tradition, the providential and salvific activity of God require us to think in much more differentiated ways about God's presence and activity in the world. There are many different forms of God's presence: theophany, vision, encounter, word of address, conversation, inspiration, empowerment, providential care, sacrament, incarnation, and others. In these many ways, God's presence is not only universal in creation, but also historical and particular. By adopting this interpretation of the metaphysical attributes, suggested above, we can, I think, do more justice than much of the tradition has done to some of these forms of God's presence with and in his creatures. They are ways in which God participates in the finite existence of his creatures in space and time, and thereby enables them to participate in his infinite life. Thinking of differentiated forms of divine presence also means we can take seriously the kinds of divine absence that Scripture describes. More controversially, perhaps, this line of approach will help us to envisage in distinction from classical theism, ways in which God freely enters relationships with his creatures, in which God not only affects them, but is affected by them. This has often been thought inconsistent with the kind of creator-creation relationship that I outlined in section 1, but this need not be the case if we think of loving relationships that God freely undertakes. Of course, in view of the absolute difference between the creator and creation, we can only speak analogically, whether cautiously or adventurously, of what such relationships mean for God. Thirdly, continuing creation. The account of the week of creation in Genesis 1 seems to differentiate rather sharply between God's creative activity at the beginning and his subsequent activity in the world. This is in line with the overall purpose of the primeval history, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which is to account for the world as we know it, subsequent to creation, fall, deluge, and Babel, since this is to be the setting for the rest of the scriptural narrative. However, other biblical accounts of creation, notably those in Psalm 104 and Job 38, give a somewhat different impression in that there is no sharp break between what God does at the beginning and his active continuing role in sustaining and providing for creation. In recent times, the notion of continuing creation has been highlighted especially by attempts to integrate into the Christian doctrine of creation what we now know about the long history of cosmic, geological, and biological development. It no longer looks as though the non-human creation was put in place at the beginning as a stage on which human history would then proceed. Human history so far has taken very little time indeed compared with the eons of natural processes and And human history is so far occurring in only a tiny corner of the vast space of the universe. But the effect of modern knowledge has not only highlighted ongoing process and change in nature, it's also made it clear that creation in this sense of continuing creation occurs through natural processes of scientifically discoverable cause and effect. If the process is grounded in God's creative activity, that divine activity is such as to involve creation itself in the ongoing work of creation. To show that this is not entirely out of tune with the biblical ways of thinking, we might point out that even in Genesis 1, not everything happens by sheer divine fiat. In two significant cases, God's command enables the sea and the earth to produce living creatures, while at the same time God can be said to have created these creatures. Some such discussions propose that we should therefore speak of creaturely co-creators with God. This is an especially popular move when human history is seen as continuous with biological evolution and human engagement with the non-human creation is seen as a kind of taking charge of the evolutionary process. In my view, talk of humans as co-creators comes too close to the Enlightenment's tendency to see humans as gods set over the rest of creation, able to remodel it to their own designs. It takes us too far from our solidarity with all creatures as all alike creatures of God, and it subverts the difference between creator and creation. In Christian form, I think it impedes the urgent task of recovering the sense of the human role in creation as a special role within creation, exercised in radical interdependence with other creatures, not a role that sets us apart from and over creation. Section 4, creation out of nothing, ex nihilo, question mark. Since the late 2nd century, Christian theologians have said that God created all things out of nothing. This somewhat odd phrase, which arose from the encounter with Platonic and Stoic philosophies, is intended to deny that God created out of some kind of pre-existing stuff, as a carpenter might make a table out of wood. Nothing should not therefore be hypostatized as though it were some kind of substance or space or state of affairs, The phrase simply means that God did not create out of anything. There was no precondition for creation other than God himself. Traditionally, the Bible was interpreted as teaching precisely this. After all, if God created all things, as the Bible often says, how could there be anything out of which he created them? Paul says expressly that God calls into existence the things that do not exist. However, it's said that such language does not necessarily exclude pre-existing material from which God created, since no actual things would have existed prior to God's creating them, only undifferentiated stuff. It could be that biblical writers were unreflective about this issue, which only arose from intellectual engagement with Platonism by later Christian thinkers. Once it was raised and considered, creation out of nothing seemed to be the necessary expression of the biblical distinction between God and creation and all other, God the creator and all other things designated as his creation. For the sake of time, I'm going to leave out the rest of this section, which is a detailed engagement in the exegesis of the first couple of chapters of Genesis, because these are now standardly said to express an idea of a sort of pre-existing state of things prior to creation. I have some doubts about whether we need to read them in that way. You can read that at your leisure if you're interested. Section 5, creation out of love. It is surely not possible to take seriously the biblical claim that God is love without ascribing creation to God's love. The Bible does not explicitly do so. From the Old Testament, we may gather that God created in order to take pleasure in creation, to rejoice in his works, as Psalm 104 puts it. In Genesis 1, the refrain, God saw that it was good, repeated after each category of creatures appears, indicates God's approbation and appreciation of what he has created. While in Proverbs 8, at the end of wisdom's account of her accompaniment of creation, we find her rejoicing in God's inhabited world and delighting in the human race. Wisdom is God's own wisdom personified, so in effect that means that God himself rejoices and delights. But the New Testament illuminates God's motives in creation further, though by implication rather than directly. It makes clear that God's activity to save and perfect the world is motivated by his love for it. In a very famous verse, from John's Gospel, God so loved the world, meaning here primarily humans, that he gave his only Son. If God so loved the world that he had created, it must follow that he loved it from before creation and created it out of love. The New Testament passages that treat Jesus Christ as God's agent in the original creation, as well as in the renewal of creation, salvation, are, among other things, indicating in this way the continuity of God's purpose of love for the world through creation and salvation. To say that God created out of love is not incompatible with the freedom of God's decision to create. To say that God made a free decision to create is not to say that the decision was arbitrary. God decides and acts in accordance with his identity and character. More difficult is the question whether God's love in any sense needs to find fulfillment in loving relationship with what is not God. The position of classical theism is that God has no needs, and his love for creation is nothing other than benevolence that seeks creation's good. But Scripture seems to portray God's love as more passionate and involved than mere benevolence, analogous to the kind of human love that is self-giving, vulnerable to disappointment and pain, but oriented to fulfillment through reciprocated love. A Trinitarian approach to the issue may say that because God is loving relationship in himself, God does not need the love of creatures in order to be fulfilled in love, but also that the Trinitarian relationships of self-giving love are the ground for God's choice to go out of himself in love for what is not God. God's desire for creation is to share with creatures the love that God is in himself. Though God does not need to create, by creating he can and does extend the circle of his love and find joy in bringing joy to his creation. In contemporary theology, there is a certain trend to speak of God's love as kenotic, that is, as involving self-limitation on God's part. And this is said to characterize God's love, both in creating anything at all, since I'm echoing the kind of terms that these theologians use, since God must withdraw himself in order to make space for what is not God. And secondly, also in giving creatures genuine freedom, thus limiting his own freedom to determine what happens in the created world. The latter seems to me more plausible than the former, but it's a highly debatable area. And finally, the goal of creation. Genesis 1 stresses the goodness of creation, but good need not mean perfect. In Genesis 1, we might say God made a good beginning, creating temporal creatures whose good lay in movement towards greater participation in God's own perfection. But the disruption of the good creation by evil requires that God must redeem as well as perfect his creation. What Christians call salvation is a combination of redemption and fulfillment. It not only rescues creation from the damage done by evil, but also completes the process of bringing creation to the goal intended from the beginning. The new creation is no mere return to the Garden of Eden, but the goal of the journey on which Adam and Eve had barely embarked before they were expelled from the garden. There is both a correspondence and a difference between the first two chapters of the Bible and the last two in the book of Revelation. In the beginning, God creates all things, and in the end, he makes all things new. In the beginning, humans live in harmony with all creatures in the garden, and in the end, they are reconciled with all creatures in a garden city, the New Jerusalem. In the beginning, God gives mortal life. Adam and Eve could die, though the tree of life in the garden represented the possibility of not dying. In the end, God gives the water of life, and the nations eat of the trees of life, symbolizing creation's participation in the eternal life of God, beyond the reach of transience and death. In the Garden of Eden, God pays Adam and Eve an occasional visit. In the new creation, he makes his home with humanity, and humans worshipping look into his face. To a large extent, these pictures of the goal of creation focus on humans, not too surprisingly in a book written for humans. But the goal is explicitly the renewal of all things, encompassing all creation. In Romans 8, one of the passages I chose for study, we are afforded a glimpse of the solidarity of humans with other creatures. As they suffer our fall, so they will share in our final liberation from evil and death. Modern ecological understanding of the world reveals how all creatures are connected with others in complex webs of interrelationship. They cannot be themselves if abstracted from such relationships. And the same applies also to humans. Christian theologians are used to thinking of relationality as essential to being human. But the concept of relationality should include the indispensability of relationship to other creatures, non-human creatures, which is too often neglected, as well as to other humans and to God. According to Genesis, only when God had created all creatures did he see creation as not just good, but very good, for the whole of creation is more than the sum of its parts. Correspondingly, only when all creatures participate intimately in the perfection of God's own life will the whole creation attain the fullness of creaturely perfection. Let me just note that I'm not going to read this, but I've given you an additional note on the Hebrew word bara, which is a kind of special word for create. It's remarkable, I think, that biblical Hebrew has a verb of which only God can be the subject, and marks out, I think, the divine creating activity is unique. And then I've also given you a couple of sort of diagrammatic analyses of what's going on in Genesis 1, which I find quite helpful to kind of focus on the content of that very, very subtly detailed account of creation.
Thanks very much, Richard. Perhaps before we open the floor, could you just say something about the text? How would you suggest we approach the texts that you chose for study?
Right.
Here they are. Here. Here we are. That's the last page.
What I did in the paper really was to give you more of a framework for reading the texts than any detailed comment on the text. But I've said a number of things about Genesis 1, which is obviously, kind of foundational and right there at the beginning of Scripture, highlighted as the key account of God's creation. I think Psalm 104 is very interesting and it does something very different. It's largely a description of the diversity of creation and God's continuing provision for creation. So I think Psalm 104 is a good complement to Genesis 1. The passage from Isaiah, I think, is a fine kind of portrayal of the creator-created difference, really, the transcendence of the creator. In some ways, I think some of that passage comes closer to material in the Quran than elsewhere. Romans 8 is this portrayal of the future destiny of the whole creation. It's one of the cases where it becomes very clear that it's not just humans, but the whole of creation that God is going to take into eternity. And finally, Colossians 1 is perhaps the most extensive account of creation and salvation, which brings Jesus Christ into creation as well as salvation, and lays out the sort of continuity of God's purpose through creation into new creation and salvation.
Thank you. So, questions, comments? Najib. Sam, do we have the other microphone as well?
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for a very lucid and direct paper. I just want to give a small comment about this language, especially the bara thing. I mean, my Muslim friends and those who know Arabic would know that in Islam, God is called Al-Bari. Al-Bari, which comes from the Arabic triad root bara'a. And bara'a in Arabic is used to speak about creation, khalaqa, creator. So you might like maybe yourself to explore more. How can you use that interpretation of bara in Hebrew and that Arabic bara'a, which means created, and have a dialogue?
Does it have the same feature as the Hebrew verb? In other words, can you only use it with God as the subject?
Actually, it's only God who is called Al-Bari.
Right. The verb. Can you use the verb? Can you use the verb of humans creating things?
No, we know in Arabic. I mean, my Muslim friends would know better than me.
Yeah.
But I don't think we use it to speak about human creation.
No, right. It's purely for God. Yeah, yeah. In that case, the usage is very, strictly parallel to the Hebrew usage. I didn't know that. That's why I asked the question, actually. Is there any other language? Because I just didn't know whether that was the case. But yeah, basically the same Semitic root, the same significance. Yeah, that's very interesting, fascinating. Mm-hmm.
You can't have a conversation just in this space. We need to move it.
I had one comment, one question. And thank you for your paper. The comment is about, if I understood it correctly, there was a reference to modern science and how through modern science we now know humans, our existence in the context of a much larger space physically. I mean, and the universe is much larger than maybe was imagined before, and also in terms of emergence of human beings on Earth. Again, the history is much longer than maybe previous generations have anticipated. So there's a realization in the modern age that we know as a fact that our existence is small in terms of space and time. My question is a comment kind of question. That's a fact, but then don't we have more than one way of interpreting that fact? Something can be small space-wise or time-wise, but still extremely important and even central. One metaphor that comes to mind from some Islamic theological text is the reference of human being as the fruit of creation, tree of creation. So there's, fruit is very small compared to the rest of the tree, but then it's in its goal, and it may stay very, short time, but it is its purpose and it's essential and central in that sense. So that was kind of a comment/question. And the second one, I don't know how to put this. It's about Trinity, and you said, you had a sentence like, Trinitarian form reflects in creation, and my question is, could you expand it a little bit? And I'm a tiny baby in Christian theology. I have no expertise in it, but I had a little bit exposure to Aquinas in connection with Trinity, and he says that there is, if I understood him correctly, I may be wrong, but he says that creation, there is no trace of Trinity in the creation, that you can look at creation and recognize the imprint of Trinity in there. You need the revelation to tell you that this product has a Trinitarian origin. So with that, when I heard you saying Trinitarian form reflects in creation, what does that mean?
I see your point. Yes, fine. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I mean, two very good questions. The first point, I actually wasn't at that point meaning to. My point was not the sort of insignificance of humans within creation. It's my point about continuing creation, you see, because traditionally people could think of God sort of creates at the beginning and sets up the world as it is and then sort of sustains it. Whereas what we now know about cosmic history, about, the actual creating of the world is going on through a long process of which, we come at the end. So it's more that idea that, creation doesn't happen all at once, that we've got to think of creation happening over a period, and also that this continuing creation, appears to occur through natural processes that we can know about through science. So one's got to think of God involved with the processes of creation. So I really, at that point, was not making the... I know people often do say that, but I think you're right. It doesn't necessarily. The fact that it's a small bit of time and a small bit of space doesn't necessarily say anything about the significance of creation. Absolutely right. Trinitarian form. Yes, I mean, Christian theologians differed about this. I mean, Augustine, for example, argued at enormous length that the sort of threefold structure of the human soul that reflects God. I'm certainly not suggesting that without knowing through revelation of the Trinity, we could, as it were, extrapolate back from creation to God. I'm suggesting that, Christians who believe that God is Trinity, and therefore is relationship in himself. That's the key point that I'm making. My general point is about God being reflected in what he creates, and God's goodness is reflected in human goodness, for example. But I also want to say that God being relationship in himself is reflected in the relational character of creation. That was my point. I wouldn't myself want to be any more specific about the Trinity than that. I think just the point about relationality is the one I'd want to make.
Thank you. Just a brief bit of clarification, perhaps, at the end of section number 5. Could you give us 2 or 3 sentences on what you find more plausible and why? I think that would be very helpful for all of us to understand what you're pointing at there. Thank you.
One issue is, what is the second verse of Genesis, which says, that the earth was, the traditional translation, the earth is without form and void and so forth. What is that actually portraying? And I think what it's portraying is not a world in chaos, as is sometimes said, or a world that God has to kind of win a victory over, some sort of, I think it's portraying a world which is unproductive, it's uninhabitable. It's a world without living creatures and incapable of giving life to living creatures or providing a habitation for them. So in contrast to that, what God does on the 6 days is to create a world that can be lived in by living creatures the first 3 days, and then he populates it with living creatures. So God's work of creation on 6 days is all about living creatures, creating the world that they can live in. So that's the first point I made. And a lot of people read Genesis 1 verse 2 differently. I think the key point it's making is about the unproductive character of what was there before God said, let there be light. I also think that, there is a kind of, in the first place one might say, because verse 2 says, the earth was without form and void, and we have just read that God created the heavens and the earth, I think it's actually quite a natural reading to suppose that it means God created the earth. But even if Genesis 1 does not mean that, I think we're entitled to read it in a canonical context. And Proverbs 8, actually, people commenting on Genesis rarely mention this, but Proverbs 8 quite clearly speaks of a time before the earth and before the watery deep, the dimension Genesis 1:2. So whatever Genesis 1:2 on its own might mean, seems to be in a larger canonical context. It's clear that the earth and the earth and the sea were not there sort of independently of God. They themselves were part of God's creative activity.
Thank you.
Were you asking about the last paragraph?
But then the second question is, how does that relate to the kenotic bit? That you say the latter seems to me more plausible than the former. And I wanted to be clear that we've understood what is more plausible than what and why.
I'm so sorry. I took you to be referring to chapter 4, section 4. You were referring to section 5. Sorry, that was all completely irrelevant. What you're actually asking, sorry, at the end of section 5. Yes, those kind of when this kind of kenotic theme is expounded, it seems to be that in relation to creation, there are these 2 elements of it. One is God creating anything at all, and the second is giving creatures freedom. I meant to say that giving creatures freedom, giving creatures genuine freedom, seems to me more plausibly described as self-limiting than the creation of anything at all. And the reason I say, you see, when people talk about this creating anything at all, they use this kind of spatial language, as though God is, as it were, the whole of the space, and to make space for creation, he has to withdraw himself. And I mean, I talked to Moltmann about this, and he said, oh yes, it's just a spatial metaphor. But once you say it's just a metaphor, I don't know what it is really. You know, I don't know what it's a metaphor. I don't see how you can get beyond the metaphor to something the metaphor is pointing to. And I can't get away from the sense that it implies that God is spatial. So that's my problem with that. And I would like to think of God creating anything at all, not as a self-limitation of God, but as a kind of God's creative love overflowing, and you know, it's kind of abundance rather than self-limitation. I see it the other way. Making a space for human freedom, I think, makes more sense, but I think I would also say that by making space for human freedom, God is actually not just limiting himself, but expressing himself. God expresses himself in giving freedom. So I'm not too happy, really, with the kenotic thing at all there. Oh, well, that would be different, yes. Yeah. But I mean, I think, you know, the people who talk about this do tend to define it as self-limiting, which is why I said that, yeah.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you, very helpful.
Just a sort of a footnote to this, the notion of the spatial language that is used, I mean, it has a direct connection to Lyrianic capitalism, to Zimzum.
Yes, indeed.
And so the sort of God, the notion of a sort of divine outpouring has much more of an ancient history. I mean, in my paper, I quote Maximus the Confessor, who's an early father, and there are many others. I think it's very interesting and has been used productively, not only by Moltmann, but by Balthasar and by Bauckham. It's many different ones who are drawing on this heritage, but one does have to remember that it's kind of provenance.
Thank you.